December 1979. Detroit, Michigan. The fluorescent lights hummed above the cramped engineering office as Robert Chen stared at the disassembled transmission laid across his workbench. The metal components gleamed under the harsh light, each piece a testament to precision that should not have been possible, not at this price point, not with this level of consistency, not from a country that American executives had been dismissing as a producer of cheap toys and transistor radios for the past 2 decades. The Honda Accord transmission before him represented something that violated every assumption the American automotive industry had made about manufacturing economics, quality control, and the supposed superiority of Detroit's mass production techniques. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Chen was 38 years old, the son of Chinese immigrants who had arrived in San Francisco in 1947 with nothing but engineering degrees that American companies initially refused to recognize. His father had worked as a janitor for 5 years before finally getting hired as a draftsman at a small machine shop. His mother had cleaned houses while teaching herself English from technical manuals she borrowed from the library. They had raised Robert with an obsession for precision, for understanding how things worked, for never accepting that something was impossible simply because everyone said it was. Chen had joined Ford Motor Company in 1965, fresh out of MIT with a degree in mechanical engineering and ideas about statistical process control that his supervisors found amusing. He had watched as American automakers dominated the global market through sheer volume, producing millions of vehicles annually with an acceptance of defects that seemed baked into the system itself. A certain percentage of cars would have problems. A certain number of transmissions would fail prematurely. A certain amount of rework would be necessary on the assembly line. These were facts of manufacturing life, immutable as gravity, or so everyone believed. But the transmission on his workbench told a different story. Chen had purchased the Honda Accord with his own money 6 months earlier, driving it daily, monitoring every aspect of its performance with the obsessive attention to detail that made his colleagues call him crazy. The vehicle had accumulated 15,000 miles without a single mechanical issue. The transmission shifted smoothly every time. The engine ran quietly. The fit and finish of the body panels was consistent to tolerances that Detroit considered theoretically achievable but economically impractical. So Chen had done what any good engineer would do. He had taken the car apart. He started with the exterior panels, measuring gaps with precision instruments. Then he moved to the interior, examining every component, every fastener, every welded joint. Finally, he reached the powertrain, and that was when his understanding of manufacturing economics began to collapse. The transmission components showed machining precision that required expensive equipment and rigorous quality control. The castings had no porosity, no inclusions, no defects that would lead to premature failure. The gears were hardened uniformly, ground to specifications that minimized noise and wear. Every single part met standards that American manufacturers considered aspirational rather than mandatory. Chen had brought samples to the Ford Metallurgy Lab after hours, running tests without authorization, using equipment when no one else was around. The steel alloys were nothing special, no exotic materials, no secret formulations. The heat treatment was conventional. The machining processes were straightforward. There was no magic, no hidden technology, no manufacturing breakthrough that explained the quality difference. The Honda engineers had simply made every single component correctly, the first time, every time. They had eliminated the variation that American manufacturers accepted as inevitable. What troubled Chen most was not that Honda could achieve this level of quality. What troubled him was that they could achieve it at a price point competitive with American vehicles that had significantly higher defect rates. The economics did not make sense according to everything Chen had learned in business school, everything his supervisors at Ford preached about acceptable quality levels and the cost of perfection. The Japanese were supposedly doing the impossible, building better products for less money, and American executives were dismissing it as a temporary anomaly, a fluke, an aberration that would correct itself once the Japanese realized they could not sustain such practices. Chen had tried to explain what he was seeing to his department head, a man named Harold Watkins who had spent 35 years at Ford and considered himself an expert on manufacturing economics. Watkins had listened politely for about 3 minutes before cutting Chen off with the kind of condescending patience reserved for young engineers who did not understand how the real world worked. The Japanese were buying market share, Watkins explained. They were selling vehicles below cost to establish a foothold in the American market. Once they achieved sufficient volume, they would raise prices and their quality would deteriorate to normal levels. It was basic economics. No manufacturer could sustain the kind of quality Chen was describing while remaining profitable. The numbers did not work. Case closed. But Chen knew the numbers did work because he had calculated them himself. He had estimated the cost of the components in the Honda transmission based on current material prices and standard machining rates. He had factored in reasonable overhead and profit margins. The transmission could be manufactured profitably at the price Honda was charging, but only if the defect rate was near zero, only if rework was eliminated, only if every process was controlled tightly enough that scrap was minimized. The Japanese were not cheating economics. They were simply executing manufacturing processes with a discipline that American companies had abandoned in favor of volume and acceptable defect rates. Chen's obsession with understanding Japanese manufacturing had begun 2 years earlier, in 1977, during a business trip to observe a supplier's operation. The supplier manufactured small electric motors for Ford's power window systems, and quality issues were causing warranty claims. Chen had been sent to investigate, to identify the source of failures, to implement corrective actions. What he found at the supplier's facility was chaos disguised as productivity. Assembly lines running at maximum speed with workers struggling to keep pace. Quality inspectors catching defects after assembly rather than preventing them during manufacturing. Stacks of reworked components awaiting reprocessing. An acceptance that a certain percentage of motors would fail in the field because perfect quality was economically impossible. The supplier's plant manager had given Chen a tour with obvious pride, pointing out the throughput rates, the number of units produced per shift, the efficiency metrics that looked impressive on paper. Chen had asked about defect rates and received a shrug. Industry standard, the manager said. Nothing unusual. Every manufacturer dealt with similar issues. The cost of achieving zero defects would exceed the cost of warranty repairs, so a balance had to be struck between quality and profitability. It was manufacturing wisdom accumulated over decades. Chen had returned to Detroit convinced that something was fundamentally wrong with American manufacturing philosophy, but without evidence that an alternative was possible. Then the Honda Accord began appearing in American driveways, followed by the Toyota Corolla, the Datsun 510, and a wave of Japanese vehicles that seemed to violate every assumption about the relationship between quality and cost. American executives dismissed them as cheap, poorly built vehicles that would fail quickly. Consumer Reports began publishing reliability data that told a different story. The Japanese vehicles were not just cheaper. They were better. They lasted longer, required fewer repairs, maintained their value. The American automotive industry's response was to mock Japanese quality while sales figures began their long, inexorable decline. Chen had a personal stake in understanding what was happening beyond professional curiosity. His younger sister, Margaret, had married a steelworker in Gary, Indiana. The steel mills were beginning to feel pressure from Japanese imports, and the union was organizing protests against what they called dumping, the practice of selling goods below cost to destroy domestic competition. Margaret's husband, Tom, had shown up at a family dinner in 1978 ranting about how the Japanese were cheating, how they were taking American jobs through unfair trade practices, how the government needed to impose tariffs to level the playing field. Chen had listened to Tom's anger and recognized it as the same denial he heard at Ford. The Japanese were not cheating. They were competing. They were building better products through better processes. The American response was to demand protection rather than improvement, to blame others rather than examine their own practices. Chen had tried to explain this to Tom, had tried to show him the Honda transmission components, had tried to demonstrate that quality was not magic but discipline. Tom had called him a traitor, accused him of siding with the enemy, and left the dinner early. Margaret had called Chen later to apologize for her husband's behavior, but Chen understood the fear beneath the anger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If American manufacturing was not inherently superior, if the Japanese could compete on quality and price simultaneously, then millions of American jobs were at risk. The implications terrified Chen more than they seemed to terrify his colleagues at Ford. He could see the trajectory clearly. Japanese manufacturers would continue improving while American companies denied there was a problem. Market share would shift gradually at first, then accelerate. Plants would close. Workers would lose jobs. Entire communities built around manufacturing would collapse. The economic consequences would be catastrophic, not because the Japanese were cheating, but because American industry had become complacent, had convinced itself that volume and acceptable defects were the only path to profitability. Chen had spent months trying to understand how Japanese manufacturers achieved their results. He read everything he could find about Japanese management techniques, which was not much in 1979. American business schools were not teaching Japanese methods because American academics believed there was nothing to learn from a country that had been rebuilding from devastation just 3 decades earlier. Chen found a few articles in obscure journals, translations of Japanese engineering publications, and one book by a quality consultant named W. Edwards Deming who had apparently worked in Japan after World War II but was largely ignored in America. Deming's ideas seemed radical by American standards. He argued that quality should be built into products during manufacturing rather than inspected afterward. He claimed that variation was the enemy of quality and that reducing variation required statistical analysis of every process. He insisted that management was responsible for quality problems, not workers, because workers could only perform as well as the systems management created. Most controversially, Deming argued that focusing on short-term profits and quarterly results destroyed long-term competitiveness. American executives needed to think in decades, not months, investing in quality improvement even when immediate returns were not apparent. Chen had tried to discuss Deming's ideas with Harold Watkins, his department head. Watkins had dismissed them immediately. Deming was a statistician, not a manufacturing expert. His theories were academic, impractical in real-world production environments where speed and volume determined profitability. Japanese companies might experiment with such ideas during their growth phase, but they would abandon them once they faced the same competitive pressures as American manufacturers. Ford had been building automobiles since 1903. The company understood manufacturing better than some consultant who thought statistics could solve everything. The rejection stung because Chen could see that Deming's ideas explained exactly what he was observing in Japanese products. The Honda transmission was not the result of expensive equipment or secret technology. It was the result of controlled processes, reduced variation, and an obsessive focus on doing things correctly the first time. Every component met specifications because every manufacturing step was monitored, measured, and adjusted to maintain consistency. Workers were trained to identify problems immediately rather than letting defective components proceed to the next operation. Quality was not inspected in at the end. It was built in throughout the entire process. Chen had become increasingly isolated at Ford as his concerns about Japanese competition intensified. His colleagues considered him pessimistic, overly focused on foreign manufacturers, insufficiently loyal to American industry. Management viewed him as a complainer who did not understand business realities. His direct supervisor had suggested during a performance review that Chen might be happier working elsewhere if he found Ford's manufacturing philosophy so problematic. The suggestion was delivered politely, but the message was clear. Stop talking about Japanese quality or find another job. The pressure might have silenced Chen except for one factor. He had a daughter, Emily, who was 7 years old in 1979. She was bright, curious, and loved taking apart toys to see how they worked. Chen would sit with her at the kitchen table, helping her understand gears and levers, explaining how mechanical systems functioned. Emily would ask why things broke, why some toys lasted longer than others, why some cars needed more repairs than others. Chen found himself explaining quality, variation, and manufacturing discipline to a 7-year-old because she asked better questions than most of his colleagues at Ford. One evening, Emily had asked her father why Americans could not build cars as good as the Honda if Japanese engineers were not smarter or better. Chen had struggled to answer. The truth was too complicated, too embedded in corporate culture and management philosophy to explain to a child. Americans could build quality vehicles. They had the knowledge, the equipment, the skilled workers. What they lacked was the commitment to do so, the willingness to change practices that had been successful for decades, the courage to admit that their assumptions about manufacturing economics were wrong. Chen had eventually told Emily that building excellent products required everyone in a company to care about quality, from executives to assembly line workers, and that sometimes companies forgot to care about the right things. They focused on building products quickly rather than building them correctly. They measured success by volume rather than customer satisfaction. They rewarded short-term results rather than long-term excellence. Emily had considered this explanation seriously, then asked why companies would not simply change if the old way was not working. Chen had no good answer for that question either. The conversation with his daughter haunted Chen because it crystallized the fundamental problem. The solution to American manufacturing's decline was not mysterious. It did not require breakthrough technology or enormous capital investment. It required changing priorities, measuring different metrics, rewarding different behaviors. It required leadership willing to say that the old ways were failing and new approaches were necessary. But admitting failure was perhaps the hardest thing for successful organizations to do, especially when those organizations had dominated their industries for decades. By late 1979, Chen had reached a breaking point. He could not continue working at Ford while watching the company ignore threats that seemed obvious to him. He could not remain silent while American manufacturing declined and millions of jobs moved offshore. He could not tell his daughter that caring about quality mattered while working for a company that treated quality as secondary to production volume. Something had to change, and if Ford would not change, then Chen would have to find another way to make an impact. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. A colleague named James Sullivan, who worked in Ford's purchasing department, mentioned during a lunch conversation that General Motors was sending a delegation to Japan in early 1980 to tour manufacturing facilities. The trip was part of a joint venture exploration with Toyota, a partnership that seemed unlikely given GM's dominance in the American market. Sullivan had heard about the trip through a contact at GM and found it amusing that America's largest automaker was apparently taking Japanese competition seriously enough to visit their factories. Chen saw opportunity where Sullivan saw oddity. If GM was sending people to Japan, perhaps other companies were as well. Perhaps some American executives were beginning to recognize that denial was not a strategy. Perhaps there was a chance to actually learn from Japanese manufacturers rather than simply dismissing them. Chen began making calls, leveraging every contact he had in the industry, trying to find anyone who was planning to visit Japanese manufacturing facilities. 3 weeks later, Chen received a call from a man named Richard Foster who worked at a consulting firm specializing in manufacturing efficiency. Foster had been hired by a consortium of American automotive suppliers to study Japanese production techniques and identify transferable practices. The project was funded quietly because the participating companies did not want to admit publicly that they needed to learn from competitors. Foster needed engineers with deep automotive manufacturing knowledge who were willing to spend several months in Japan observing, documenting, and analyzing production systems. Would Chen be interested? Chen said yes before Foster finished explaining the compensation. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the opportunity to understand Japanese manufacturing deeply enough to prove that their success was replicable, not based on cultural factors or unique circumstances that Americans could not duplicate. If Chen could document exactly how Japanese manufacturers achieved superior quality at competitive costs, perhaps American companies would listen. Perhaps change was possible. Perhaps his daughter's generation would inherit an American manufacturing sector that competed through excellence rather than seeking protection through tariffs. There was one problem. Accepting Foster's offer meant leaving Ford, burning bridges with colleagues who already viewed Chen as disloyal, and gambling his career on a project that might produce nothing useful. Chen's wife, Susan, was supportive but worried. They had a mortgage, a daughter in school, aging parents who needed help. Chen's salary at Ford was stable, his position secure despite management's frustration with his constant warnings about Japanese competition. Walking away from that security to spend months in a foreign country documenting manufacturing practices that most American executives would probably ignore seemed risky at best, reckless at worst. Chen and Susan talked late into the night, weighing options, assessing risks. Susan finally asked the question that mattered most. If Chen stayed at Ford, continued collecting his salary, and watched American automotive manufacturing decline over the next decade without trying to change anything, would he regret that choice? Chen knew the answer immediately. He would regret inaction far more than any career risk. Some opportunities came once in a lifetime. This was one of them. In January 1980, Robert Chen resigned from Ford Motor Company after 14 years. His exit interview with Harold Watkins was brief and uncomfortable. Watkins wished him well while making it clear that Chen was making a mistake, abandoning a stable career at a great American company to chase theories about Japanese manufacturing that would prove irrelevant once market conditions normalized. Chen thanked Watkins for his time at Ford and said nothing about where he was going or what he planned to do. There was no point arguing with someone who had already decided that change was impossible. Richard Foster's consulting project was more ambitious than Chen initially understood. The consortium funding the study included 6 American automotive suppliers who were beginning to lose contracts to Japanese competitors. These suppliers manufactured everything from electrical components to stamped metal parts, representing a cross-section of automotive supply chains. They were not asking Foster to help them lobby for tariff protection. They were asking him to help them compete, which meant understanding exactly what Japanese manufacturers were doing differently. Foster had assembled a small team. Besides Chen, there was Patricia Morgan, an industrial engineer from MIT who specialized in production layout and workflow optimization. There was David Kim, a quality control specialist from a bearing manufacturer who had taught himself enough Japanese to read technical documents. There was Foster himself, who had worked as a manufacturing consultant for 20 years and had the credibility with executives to ensure the study's findings would be taken seriously, assuming the findings did not challenge too many assumptions. The team spent 6 weeks preparing for the Japan trip, studying available literature on Japanese management techniques, learning basic Japanese business etiquette, and developing observation protocols. They would visit 12 manufacturing facilities over 3 months, spending approximately 1 week at each location. The facilities included Toyota's manufacturing plants, suppliers to Honda and Nissan, and several independent manufacturers producing everything from cameras to industrial equipment. The goal was to identify common practices across different industries, practices that could be transferred to American manufacturing contexts. Chen immersed himself in preparation with the intensity he brought to every engineering challenge. He learned enough Japanese to understand technical conversations, studied the history of Japan's post-war industrial development, and read everything he could find about Toyota's production system. What he discovered during preparation was that Japanese manufacturing excellence was not an accident or a temporary phenomenon. It was the result of deliberate choices made in the 1950s when Japanese industry was rebuilding from wartime devastation. Japan had faced unique constraints after World War II. The country lacked natural resources, had limited capital for investment, and needed to compete against established American and European manufacturers who had superior technology and economies of scale. Japanese companies could not win through volume production or resource advantages. They had to win through efficiency, quality, and innovation. These constraints forced Japanese manufacturers to develop production systems that eliminated waste, reduced variation, and engaged every employee in continuous improvement. The architect of Toyota's production system was a man named Taichi Ono, an engineer who had studied American manufacturing techniques and concluded that mass production was fundamentally wasteful. American factories carried enormous inventories of parts because their processes were unreliable. They employed quality inspectors because defects were expected. They operated with the assumption that speed created efficiency, even when speed generated scrap and rework that consumed more resources than careful production would have required. Ono had developed an alternative approach based on several radical principles. Produce only what customers ordered, eliminating inventory costs. Build quality into every process step, eliminating inspection costs. Give workers authority to stop production when problems occurred, fixing issues immediately rather than letting defects proceed. Reduce setup times so equipment could produce small batches economically, providing flexibility to respond to changing customer demands. Involve every employee in identifying and solving problems, treating workers as problem solvers rather than interchangeable labor. The Toyota production system, as Ono's approach became known, violated every assumption of American mass production. American factories believed that stopping assembly lines reduced efficiency. Toyota stopped lines hundreds of times per day to prevent defects. American factories believed that large batches created economies of scale. Toyota produced in small batches to reduce inventory. American factories separated thinking from doing, with engineers designing systems and workers executing. Toyota expected workers to improve systems continuously, contributing ideas that incrementally enhanced productivity. Chen found Ono's ideas simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. Obvious because they made logical sense once explained. Revolutionary because they inverted nearly every practice that American manufacturers considered fundamental to profitable production. The question was whether these ideas actually worked in practice or whether they sounded good in theory but failed under real-world pressures. Chen was traveling to Japan to answer that question definitively. The team departed for Japan in March 1980. Chen's last conversation before leaving was with his daughter Emily, who was concerned that her father would be gone for 3 months. Chen promised to write letters every week and to bring back interesting gifts. Emily made him promise to figure out why Japanese products were better so that American companies could make good products too. Chen promised to try, knowing that understanding the problem was easier than convincing people to change. The flight to Tokyo took 13 hours. Chen spent most of the time reading technical documents and reviewing the observation protocols the team had developed. Patricia Morgan sat beside him, equally focused on preparation. They discussed what they expected to find, what questions they would ask, what measurements they would take. Both were careful not to form conclusions before observing anything, but both had hypotheses based on their analysis of Japanese products. The quality difference was real, and it had to come from somewhere, from specific practices that could be documented and potentially transferred. Tokyo in March 1980 was a city recovering from recession but still vibrant with economic energy. The team checked into a hotel in a business district and spent their first day adjusting to time differences and meeting with their local coordinator, a Japanese manufacturing consultant named Hiroshi Tanaka who would arrange facility visits and provide translation when needed. Tanaka was in his 50s, had worked in manufacturing for 30 years, and understood both Japanese and American production systems well enough to explain differences clearly. Over dinner that first evening, Tanaka asked the team what they expected to discover. Richard Foster gave a diplomatic answer about learning best practices. Patricia Morgan mentioned interest in production layout and workflow. David Kim talked about quality control systems. Chen said he wanted to understand how Japanese manufacturers eliminated variation. Tanaka smiled at Chen's response and said that was the correct question. Variation was the enemy of quality, and reducing variation required systemic discipline that most Western manufacturers found difficult to sustain. The challenge was not understanding what to do but maintaining the commitment to do it consistently. The first facility visit was scheduled for the following morning at a Toyota supplier manufacturing stamped metal components for vehicle bodies. Chen barely slept that night, too excited and anxious about what he might discover. Years of questions, months of preparation, weeks of argument with colleagues who insisted Japanese quality was a myth or unsustainable, it all came down to what he would observe over the next 3 months. If Japanese manufacturing excellence was real and replicable, American industry could change. If it was based on factors impossible to transfer, cultural elements or economic conditions unique to Japan, then American manufacturing might be doomed to decline. Chen was about to find out which future awaited his country. The Toyota supplier facility opened at 7 in the morning, and Chen's team arrived 15 minutes early. The plant manager, a man named Kenji Yamamoto, greeted them formally but warmly. He had been briefed about the American delegation and seemed genuinely pleased to show them the operation. Yamamoto spoke limited English, so Hiroshi Tanaka translated as they walked through the entrance. What struck Chen immediately was the cleanliness. American stamping plants were noisy, dirty environments with oil residue covering floors and equipment. This facility sparkled. The concrete floor showed no stains. The stamping presses gleamed. Work areas were organized with tools in designated locations, marked with painted outlines. Nothing was out of place. Chen had visited dozens of American manufacturing facilities. None looked like this. Yamamoto led them to the first stamping press, a massive machine that formed sheet metal into body panels. In American plants, these presses ran continuously, producing thousands of parts before stopping for die changes. The setup process took hours, sometimes an entire shift, which meant producing large batches was the only economical approach. Yamamoto explained through Tanaka that this press changed dies multiple times per shift, producing small batches of different parts based on assembly line demand. Patricia Morgan asked how long die changes took. Yamamoto said 8 minutes. Morgan assumed Tanaka had mistranslated. She asked again. 8 minutes, Tanaka confirmed. Morgan looked at Chen with visible shock. American stamping plants needed 4 to 6 hours for die changes. 8 minutes was impossible. Yamamoto smiled and offered to demonstrate. The press operator received a signal indicating the current production run was complete. He pressed a button stopping the machine. 2 workers appeared with a wheeled cart carrying the next die. The team watched as the crew removed mounting bolts, lifted the old die using an overhead crane, positioned the new die, secured it, and ran test stampings to verify alignment. 7 minutes and 40 seconds elapsed from stop to restart. The press was producing a different part, and the dimensional checks confirmed every piece met specifications. Chen asked Yamamoto how they achieved such rapid changeovers. Yamamoto explained that Toyota had studied die change processes for years, breaking each step into smaller components, identifying delays, and eliminating wasted motion. Bolts were pre-positioned. Tools were organized within reach. Die heights were standardized so adjustments were minimal. Most critically, workers practiced changeovers repeatedly, treating speed and precision as skills requiring constant refinement. The implications cascaded through Chen's understanding of manufacturing economics. If die changes took 8 minutes instead of 6 hours, small batch production became viable. If small batches were viable, inventory could be minimized. If inventory was minimized, capital was freed for other investments. If production matched actual demand rather than forecast, the risk of unsold inventory disappeared. The entire logic of mass production dissolved. David Kim noticed something else. The stamping press had a rope hanging beside it with a sign in Japanese. Tanaka translated, "Pull if problems occur." Kim asked what happened when someone pulled the rope. Yamamoto said the production line stopped, a supervisor came immediately, and the team identified the cause of the problem. Kim asked how often the line stopped. Yamamoto said between 10 and 20 times per shift. Kim nearly choked. American automotive executives considered stopping production lines as manufacturing failure. Yamamoto considered it quality control. Chen asked to speak with press operators directly. Yamamoto agreed and introduced them to Takeshi Sato, who had worked at the facility for 12 years. Through Tanaka, Chen asked Sato about his responsibilities. Sato explained that operators were expected to produce quality parts, identify process improvements, train new workers, and maintain equipment. When Chen asked about quality inspectors, Sato looked confused. He was the quality inspector. Every operator inspected their own work. Patricia Morgan asked about production quotas. Did operators face pressure to maintain speed? Sato said their responsibility was to produce parts correctly. Speed came from eliminating problems, not from rushing. If a process generated defects, operators stopped and fixed the cause. Management measured defect rates, not just throughput. The goal was 0 defects, not maximum volume. The team spent 8 hours at the facility, observing multiple processes, interviewing workers and supervisors, documenting practices that seemed impossible by American standards. Everything Chen had theorized based on examining the Honda transmission was validated. Japanese manufacturing discipline was real, systematic, and replicable. The practices did not require advanced technology or massive capital investment. They required different priorities and sustained commitment to improvement. Over the following weeks, the team visited 11 more facilities. They toured Toyota assembly plants where the famous production system operated at full scale. They observed Honda's engine manufacturing facility where machining tolerances exceeded American aerospace standards. They visited Canon's camera factory where workers assembled complex optical systems with defect rates measured in parts per million rather than percentage points. Every facility demonstrated the same fundamental principles: eliminate waste, reduce variation, engage workers, stop when problems occur, improve continuously. Chen documented everything obsessively. He filled notebooks with process diagrams, statistical measurements, and quotations from Japanese workers and managers. He photographed production layouts, tool organization systems, and quality control procedures. He recorded interviews discussing management philosophy, training programs, and improvement methodologies. The evidence accumulated into an overwhelming conclusion: Japanese manufacturing excellence was neither accident nor unsustainable cost structure. It was the result of systematic discipline applied consistently over decades. The most revealing visit was to a small supplier manufacturing automotive electronics. The company employed 200 workers and competed against American firms 10 times larger. The facility manager, a woman named Yuko Nakamura, had worked her way up from assembly line operator over 20 years. She explained that Japanese suppliers succeeded against larger American competitors because they focused on capabilities rather than scale. American companies relied on volume to spread fixed costs. Japanese companies invested in flexibility, quality, and speed, allowing them to serve customers better despite smaller size. Nakamura showed the team her facility's suggestion system. Every employee was expected to submit improvement ideas regularly. The company implemented approximately 60% of suggestions, with workers receiving recognition and small bonuses for adopted ideas. Last year, employees had submitted over 3,000 suggestions. The cumulative impact of incremental improvements was substantial cost reduction and quality enhancement without major capital investment. Richard Foster asked Nakamura the question that haunted American executives: how could Japanese manufacturers achieve superior quality while remaining price competitive? Nakamura's answer was simple. Quality reduced costs rather than increasing them. Defects were expensive. Rework consumed labor and materials. Scrap wasted resources. Warranty claims damaged reputation and required service infrastructure. Preventing defects during production eliminated all these costs. Building quality in was cheaper than inspecting quality afterward. Chen recognized that Nakamura had articulated the fundamental insight American manufacturers missed. They treated quality and cost as opposing objectives requiring balance. Japanese manufacturers treated quality as the path to lower costs. The paradigm difference explained everything. American companies accepted defects because they believed perfection was expensive. Japanese companies pursued perfection because they knew defects were expensive. During the third month, the team visited Deming's former students, quality professionals who had learned statistical process control directly from the American consultant who helped revolutionize Japanese manufacturing. These experts explained that Deming's greatest contribution was not specific techniques but philosophical transformation. He convinced Japanese executives that quality was a management responsibility, not a worker problem. He demonstrated that variation could be measured and reduced systematically. He proved that long-term thinking created sustainable competitive advantage. The irony was painful. An American consultant teaching methods ignored in America had transformed Japanese manufacturing while American companies dismissed his ideas as impractical. Deming was honored in Japan, unknown in his home country. His techniques were standard practice in Japanese factories, curiosities in American plants. The prophet rejected at home became the architect of competitor success. By late May 1980, the team had completed their facility visits and returned to America with documentation that filled 4 large cases. They had observed, measured, and verified that Japanese manufacturing excellence was real, replicable, and based on principles American industry could adopt if executives chose to do so. The question was whether American business leaders would accept findings that contradicted decades of assumptions about manufacturing economics. Richard Foster spent 6 weeks preparing the final report. The document exceeded 300 pages, including detailed process descriptions, statistical analyses, photographic evidence, and recommendations for transferring Japanese practices to American contexts. Foster organized a presentation for the consortium companies funding the study, inviting their executives to review findings before wider distribution. The presentation occurred in August 1980 at a conference room in Detroit. 15 executives representing automotive suppliers attended, along with Chen's team. Foster presented for 2 hours, walking through observations, explaining Japanese practices, and demonstrating that superior quality resulted from systematic discipline rather than cultural factors or unsustainable economics. Chen provided technical details, answering questions about specific manufacturing processes. The initial response was skepticism. Several executives questioned whether the team had been shown showcase facilities rather than typical operations. Others suggested that Japanese labor costs were lower, allowing more intensive quality control. Some argued that American workers would not accept the responsibility Japanese workers assumed. The resistance was palpable. Then Michael Harrison, CEO of a company manufacturing electrical components, asked the question that mattered. If Japanese practices were adopted immediately, how long would it take to achieve comparable quality? Foster said 3 to 5 years of sustained effort, assuming management commitment remained consistent. Harrison asked what would happen if American suppliers did not adopt these practices. Chen answered bluntly. They would lose market share progressively, then close permanently. Japanese competitors would take their business. Harrison stood and thanked the team for honest assessment. His company would begin implementing Japanese techniques immediately. Several other executives nodded agreement. The meeting concluded with half the attendees committed to change and half remaining skeptical. Chen had hoped for unanimous support but recognized that convincing half was progress. Over the following months, the report circulated through American automotive industry. Some companies implemented recommendations aggressively. Others filed the report and continued business as usual. General Motors initiated a joint venture with Toyota that would eventually become NUMMI, a California plant demonstrating Japanese methods with American workers. Ford hired consultants to study quality improvement. Chrysler faced financial crisis that would force transformation later. Chen joined one of the forward-thinking suppliers as vice president of operations, given authority to implement Japanese practices throughout the company. The transformation was difficult. Workers initially resisted stopping production for quality issues, having been trained that throughput mattered most. Supervisors struggled with empowering operators rather than controlling them. Executives grew impatient when immediate results did not appear. But Chen persisted, supported by a CEO who recognized that survival required change. Within 18 months, defect rates dropped by 70%. Inventory decreased by half. Customer satisfaction improved dramatically. The company became profitable in a recession that devastated competitors. Other suppliers noticed and began calling Chen for advice. By 1985, a small but growing number of American manufacturers had adopted Japanese practices successfully. Quality improved. Costs decreased. competitiveness returned. The transformation was slow, uneven, and incomplete, but direction had changed. American industry was learning, finally, that quality and profitability were aligned rather than opposed. Chen's daughter Emily was 13 in 1985, old enough to understand what her father had accomplished. She asked if American manufacturing would survive. Chen said it would, but only if companies continued learning, improving, and respecting that excellence required sustained discipline. Complacency was the real enemy, and defeating complacency meant never declaring victory. The story of how Japan mocked American manufacturing quality and proved completely wrong had a twist ending. Japan had not mocked American quality. Japan had simply built better products while American executives convinced themselves it was temporary or unsustainable. The mockery was self-inflicted, a refusal to see reality until evidence became overwhelming. By the time American industry acknowledged Japanese excellence, millions of jobs had moved offshore and entire industries had declined. Robert Chen had tried to warn colleagues years before most listened. He had documented exactly how Japanese manufacturers achieved their results. He had proven that their methods were transferable. The tragedy was not that solutions were impossible. The tragedy was that pride, denial, and institutional inertia delayed action until damage was catastrophic. Manufacturing excellence was not mysterious. It was simply difficult, requiring commitment that many organizations lacked until crisis forced change. In later years, Chen would give presentations at business schools and industry conferences. He would show the Honda transmission he disassembled in 1979, explaining how it revealed quality differences that most American executives dismissed. He would describe facility visits in Japan where workers stopped production lines to prevent defects while American executives insisted such practices destroyed productivity. He would emphasize that Japanese manufacturing success came not from advantages but from choices, decisions to prioritize quality over volume, long-term reputation over quarterly profits, worker engagement over management control. The lesson Chen taught was that competitive advantage came from doing common things uncommonly well, from maintaining discipline when competitors cut corners, from investing in capabilities when others focused solely on costs. Japanese manufacturers had not discovered secret techniques. They had simply committed to excellence with intensity that American companies found uncomfortable until market share losses made discomfort irrelevant. American manufacturing eventually recovered much of its competitive position, but the recovery took decades and the landscape had changed permanently. Industries that ignored quality lost to competitors who prioritized it. Workers who lost jobs in the 1980s never returned to manufacturing. Communities that depended on factories that closed never fully recovered. The cost of learning late exceeded the cost of listening early by orders of magnitude. Chen retired in 2005, having spent 25 years helping American manufacturers adopt practices he first observed in Japan. His career became a case study in the importance of learning from competitors rather than dismissing them. He had tried to warn his industry when warnings might have prevented crisis. When warnings were ignored, he documented solutions. When documentation was questioned, he demonstrated results. Eventually, enough people listened that change became possible. The transmission that started Chen's journey sits in his home office, a reminder that understanding begins with examination, that quality reveals itself to those willing to look carefully, and that assumptions must be tested against evidence. Emily, now a manufacturing executive herself, sometimes borrows the transmission to show her own teams, explaining that her father's greatest insight was recognizing that excellence was a choice, not an accident, and that choosing excellence required humility to learn from whoever did things best, regardless of where they were from or what preconceptions needed to be abandoned. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.